Yo, you there?
Oh,
Is so we got the toggle going. That's awesome. The embed. Is the link up on Cargo?
no, I'll do that now. Do, 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 do. Collect the link. How are you doing this morning?
Okay. I didn't get any sleep last night.
Oh, that's what happened to me the night before. I just woke up and I couldn't go back to sleep.
Yeah. It's a bummer.
Was it that kind of thing, or were you just also up late? Or
Yeah, I mean, I was drafting until midnight last night. And then just, I don't know, couldn't chill out after that. And then was anticipating this and, all the rest.
I hear it.
I think maybe we have a friend. Hello out there.
So
I'm just gonna keep looking at this intro for a quick sec.
yeah.
Amazing. I see the Zoom, see the link. I say we toggle whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm just writing into the chat. As soon as I'm done with that, I will toggle.
Amazing. Thank you, Sal.
My pleasure.
You zooming early today? I'll let you work.
No, I actually slept late, and but let me just do this because
Sure, yeah. Totally.
Okay, so let's toggle. I see us.
Amazing. I see us too. It's still thrilling.
It is. Oh no, this is pretty magical. I think the pipe through.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
I think it's quite something. Hey, Paul's talk is at
30.
it's at 1:30. That's amazing. So we have a little bit of breathing room.
Yeah, I believe so. I'll check for sure, but I believe so.
That's so awesome. There's Hermione Spriggs.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
How you doing?
Hello.
Oh, you have your ball cap on too. I feel better.
Yeah, I feel what is it? It's protection.
Yes,
From Zoom.
mine too.
It like keeps the vital energies in rather than having them go wiggle all over.
That's what's up.
How you
So
doing?
good to see you. Great. Super good. Super psyched to host this. Thanks for putting this together, Hermione.
Total pleasure. Yeah, it's really nice. It's really nice. It'll be good for you to meet tomorrow as well. She is just on her merry way.
Yes.
But yeah, all good here. Like spring is just beginning to spring. And things are just beginning to lift lockdown wise. I think maybe there are a couple people who are in this Zoom, is that improper? Should they be instead watching it through YouTube?
No,
No, I think that's great.
This is the one for everybody. Okay,
Yeah.
great. I wasn't
is
sure if
what-
it was going to be meet on here and then stream elsewhere.
Well, in fact, we are streaming on YouTube. And you can go to, if you go to the Dispersed Fair site right now,
Yes.
we are live.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, dispersed. Oh, I see what you're saying. Great.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, that's where I directed people. So
Mhm.
they'll be able to find that.
Alex, if you can hear me, you are welcome to stick around. This way you can participate in the Q&A, and it makes no difference to us. So, yeah, we sent out the Zoom link to everybody, and we're hoping that people join here.
Yeah, I didn't pass around the YouTube live link, although I could if people want it.
Do you have a link for where we are on the Printed Matter site? Because I think I'm missing that somehow.
If you go to our page, so
Yeah.
yep, it's right.
First at pmvabf.org.
Mhm, mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And we are, see beneath the, there's a watch here sort of link beneath the description of the event.
For our one, or for more info here.
For lockdown stalking.
Oh, Ludo.
Hi, Tamara.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Cool.
Ah, well, that just takes me to a hi tomorrow.
Hi, Hermione.
Hey.
I'm here with Jen.
Oh, great.
Hello.
Hey. Nice to meet you, Jen.
Hi.
Tamara, David, Sal from Dispersed Holdings.
Hi, Sal. Hi, David.
Super nice to meet you. Thank you so much for putting this together.
Not at all. It's been really fun doing it. Fun / terrifying.
Yeah, it seems like it gets a little terrifying at the end, which is exciting.
That just takes me to a hi tomorrow.
Hermione, are you having luck with the links?
Yeah, I think I just got a YouTube link, which is great. Maybe I'll just throw that over to a couple of people to make it obvious. That's great.
Sure.
What would it be like if we recorded this session and then we had this recording for later if we wanted to have it? Would you like
Great.
that?
I mean, most of it is recorded anyway, but it would be so much nicer to have it, yeah, with your faces involved in the conversation afterwards.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's
It's easy to
record
do,
it.
eh?
We may not use it for anything, but you never know really what life is going to bring. Indeed.
Yeah,
Let's
you
put it on the page.
The cystic one spreading from you.
Cool. So I think let's wait a couple minutes and let some folks arrive. I know at least a few people who will be here. So.
I watched about, I think, 4 out of the 5 films with breakfast this morning and the screening program. Really beautiful.
Amazing stuff, right?
Yeah.
Sophia is, such a talent. And of course, I mean, maybe you know this. She does have the cover of the new book. This is cyanotype collage. Yeah, that work is excellent, and a lot of it I was unfamiliar with, so I was really psyched that Sophia brought it to our attention. Really nice to put that program together.
A real liveliness and immediacy in all of them. Little portals.
Tamara, where are you calling from? Oh, I think I'll be on mute.
You're muted, Tamara.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can, yeah.
I'm in Scotland. Right now I'm in a place called Galloway, down in the southwest, but I've been spending most of my time a bit further north, but still on the west coast.
Amazing.
It's a really beautiful day here. It's been like incredibly warm and sunny.
That makes me happy to hear. That's great.
So nice. It's like, yeah, you can hear the woodpeckers, and like spring is finally arriving.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, we're getting a little relief here. I'm calling from Massachusetts,
Yeah.
where it's been just a very snowy winter. And
Well, the Massachusetts winter is 6 months long. I did my grad school in Massachusetts, and I remember just being really angry. The only months of the year that it's habitable there are the months where you're not expected to be in school.
yeah. Yeah, angry, I think, is a good response. It's very, very
You can really see
mobilizing.
it on the roads when you're driving there. People are just blatantly angry all the time. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
The
We're
other
in
option, of course, is sadness. So anger is, I think, maybe, there's something.
Yeah.
It's a bit more lively. Actually.
Yeah.
Are you in Boston area? Are you in somewhere?
No,
West-
Western Massachusetts. I'm in Northampton.
Yeah. Cool.
And where are you, Sal?
I'm in New York,
Oh, you're in
where the snow is just melting off I have a little deck out my apartment. So we've had some unusually wintry winter this year. A lot of snow.
It's been wintry inside and out this year.
I miss going places, actual physical places. Great.
Yeah.
A great, like, I don't know if you know Room Rater on Twitter, but they rate people's backgrounds, Zoom backgrounds, for different different people's like presentations, like broadcasters who are broadcasting from home, newscasters or whatever. But I think you do well on Room Rater. You have that nice little stack of that pamphlet showing flowers behind you. Maybe they're a little occluded by your neck, perhaps. But
I did reposition the daffodils for this purpose. It's more a matter of hiding the things that you'd prefer, like probably weren't zooming into the public sphere than.
All right, shall we give it another minute and then get going? We'll be able to share the recording with the masses.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
I feel like we should hide now, maybe tomorrow. What do you think? Otherwise, it's going to be quite glitchy when we shift from being here to like being here, but not actually in the present, but pretending to.
Like hide under the table or hide
under the table would be preferable. Yeah, that's good.
I think we can handle it. I really do. I think we can handle these reality glitches that are part of our daily lives now.
It's a new muscle that's developing, certainly.
Ooh, new quivery.
Hi, Jeffrey. We're actually making a recording of this.
Oh yes.
Brilliant. Nice one. Thank you.
All right. Shall we? Let's do it. Okay. Happy free. Awesome. Okay, great, Jeffrey. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. To all the on YouTube streaming, hello, nice to see you. My name's David. I just wanted to say a few things before we begin here. First off, this is Lockdown Stalking, conversation between Hermione Spriggs and Tamara Colchester, an event we're really, really excited to host. So thank you to both Tamara and Hermione. To those of you who might be new to Dispersed Holdings, I just wanted to say a couple brief things about the project. Dispersed began in 2015. My friend Sal Randolph and I started it in New York City. We ran it as a space for a while. We had a space downtown in New York between 2016 and 2018, and we hosted all manner of events there. Since leaving the space, we've been making publications on the basis of those events with many of our collaborators, of whom Hermione Spriggs is one. We've had the pleasure of working with Hermione now through 2 publications. Hermione has a wonderful contribution to our 2020 title, Reading Room, which is all about practices of reading. And Hermione also has a wonderful essay in our newest book, which is the reason for our being at the fair here. This is Reading Now, which is a sort of update of the 2020 publication Reading Room, and also a book about reading practices in 2020, how the pandemic and political uprisings sort of shaped and reshaped what reading was like this year. We are super psyched now to hear from Hermione and Tamara Colchester. I'm going to play the pre-recorded talk. So I'm going to screen share. We'll watch it together. And then we're going to have a Q&A after. So please, as you're watching, if questions arise, do note them. We'll probably run it through the chat, although this is a collegial number of participants. Maybe we can just open up the mics towards the end. We might experiment. We'll see how it goes. There's a section of the video towards the end where we might do the Q&A sort of as it's playing. But we'll see how that plays out once we get there. So if folks seem ready, then we can I'll screen share and start the video. Hermione, Tamara, would you like to say anything? Or very good. Okay. Let's do it then. Sal, I think, could you enable my sharing?
Yes, sorry. There you go.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hermione Spriggs, and it's great to be here as part of the Printed Matter Book Fair. Thank you so much to David and Sal from Dispersed Holdings for offering up the platform, to myself and to my friend, collaborator Tamara Colchester, to talk a little bit about our relationship to animal tracking and trailing, and how this language of tracking animals that we've both been exploring over the last couple of years relates in various ways to reading and to writing. So first, I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing you to what I am currently up to right now in North Yorkshire. And then I will invite Tamara to join me and introduce her and her work. We will then have a chat, the two of us. And after that, we will share a couple of the trails that we've both been following.
I've just moved to Stokesley, a small town on the northeast edge of the North York Moors, to work with people who are pest control professionals, and to learn about the skills and knowledges that they employ to effectively communicate with, lure and entrap other animals. And my interest in the life worlds of these particular people is driven by a feeling that they inhabit a mode of attending to animal worlds and perspectives which moves beyond anthropocentric thought, and is actually profoundly ecological, despite the fact that it also includes all sorts of contradictory aspects, not least the violence that is involved with ending animal lives. And so I'm exploring this contradiction, and looking at also how relationships of predation and the kinds of tricking practices that fold into the creation of a successful trap might themselves belie a slightly different attitude towards thinking ecologically than the one that we're generally accustomed to, and the kinds of creativity that are involved in reading the landscape from a trapper's perspective and crafting objects, traps, lures and decoys that work upon an animal in a particular way by attuning themselves to that animal's perspective. So I'm right at the beginning of what feels like an apprenticeship to the people who I'll be working with out here, but also an apprenticeship to the more than human world that they themselves engage with and that their work draws them into. Like the expert animal tracker Lewis Liebenberg says, the art of tracking, of following the traces left by animals, is actually at the origin of reading and writing. So I'm thinking about this work as effectively as learning to read again, learning to read another language, and to write another language into the landscape through the setting up of traps. I'm working between the Slade and the UCL anthropology department, and so a lot of my colleagues who are doing their own field research at the moment are learning languages like Indigenous Guarani. And if it wasn't for COVID, I'd actually be in First Nations Canada right now, perhaps learning the basics of Cree myself. But instead, and in fact it feels equally challenging, I'm learning to read mole and worm and rat and hare and rabbit and fox and roe deer and pigeon and seagull. Learning to read mole seems to lead to learning to read worm, because moles themselves are reading and interpreting the behavioral languages and the postures and preferences of the worms that they're hunting to eat. So the worm instructs the mole, and the mole instructs the mole trapper, and I'm apprenticing to the mole trapper who has access to these chains of relationship. The more time I've spent with trackers and trappers, the more I've come to realize that they're conducting a kind of research into the worlds of other animals and producing new knowledge about those worlds. In a way which feels pretty similar to the way in which anthropologists study and interpret human social behaviour. So I've come to think of my friends who work in pest control as anthropologists of other animals. So there are sort of two parts to this practice research conducted by pest control trappers. The first part is tracking, reading the landscape, interpreting subtle material signs known as spoor, traces left by animals, little bent twigs and browse marks on the plants they've been eating, slots that their hoofs or feet make in the ground, which is a kind of reading. Tracking is a kind of reading. The other side to their work is the writing side, the writing of the knowledge that they've accumulated into material infrastructures which communicate back towards those animals. And so this is the setting up of traps. And kind of message encoded might be, come here, this is going to be delicious, or it might be, this is a safe place to be, or maybe even the presentation of an intrigue or puzzle that captures the animal's curiosity, a bit like a work of art. So if we think of tracking as a sort of anthropology of other animals, then the trapping itself is a way of making art for other animals. It's a sort of more than human aesthetic production with its own sensory codes and technical excellence, and also tragic humor.
Hi. Oh. So I wanted to begin by introducing our band called Limp Whoop. Named after the sound that you make when you want to express glee publicly, but you don't have the confidence to follow through, and so a limp whoop comes out. This is our first live gig, so get ready, everybody.
It's perfect.
So joining me now is Tamara Colchester, my very close friend and fellow animal tracker. We're actually we're in the morning at the moment. We had a conversation that we recorded last night, which was a really good conversation, but we went in quite deep and fast, and it got pretty heavy. So we'll share that recording, but it will have a relatively abrupt end. And we thought we'd just meet once more to premise the conversation and give a more of an introduction to ourselves before launching in. So by way of brief introduction, Tamara is actually wholly responsible for my own interest in tracking and led me to this trail in the first place. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and very shortly after, Tamara invited me to join her on a tracking course led by John Ryder in the Sussex woods. And so we spent a series of very long weekends together over the winter 2020, picking up the basic skills and philosophy of animal tracking, which is sort of the origin of all of these things that we share. So before returning to yesterday's conversation, I just wanted to invite Tamara to say a little bit more about where she is at the moment, maybe a little about how she got here. Tamara has a background in foraging and knows a lot about indigenous plants and their uses and their interesting relationships between foraging, hunting, and tracking, which will probably also come to the fore in the conversation. But yeah, welcome, Tamara. It's really lovely to be doing this with you. And perhaps you just want to say like where you are right at this minute and what you're working on at the moment.
So I'm here in Scotland on the West Coast, and I've been here for about a year and a half, learning about the tradition of tracking here in Scotland, which is known as stalking. And it's slightly different to where we learned, which was down in the Sussex woodland. Up here, you're on the open hill. So there's a very different mode of attention, a very different relationship with landscape, very different weather. So it's deepening and journeying further into the skills and techniques we began to learn about. But because it's a different terrain, you're having to adapt and sort of pay a different kind of attention, which has been really wonderful actually, to recognize how closely located to terrain and to place the process of tracking is, and that you can track anywhere, but you're going to be paying a very different kind of attention wherever you are, because you're in a different place, and that's offering you so much more. The information varies so much, and the behavior of the animals changes so much. So it's been a very enriching process, and the learning about it has been complicated but also quite blissful. Trying to write about it has been really hard, because translating the embodied experience of tracking, stalking, as it's known here, is something that I've discovered along the way, to my surprise, to my dismay, but more and more I'm kind of thrilled by it, that this is something that doesn't want to be locked into language. This is something that is perhaps asking for a different kind of holding, and I don't even know if it can be locked into something like language. And so that's a real journey, and that's a really humbling thing right now as a writer, to recognize that perhaps the way I thought I wanted to record an experience might not be the right way. And language is really important to both of us. I know we love words, and we love to play with words, and we love talking about tracking. But can we satisfyingly write about the experiences we're both sharing? Remains a huge question.
It's something that really surprised me when we began the course with John Ryder. I expected to be taken to the woods and shown how to recognize different animal tracks. I didn't even understand before we began that course that it was going to be solely focused on fallow deer, and that it would come, this training, with its own language and philosophy and set of concepts, which is this sort of toolkit both for reading and experiencing and engaging with the landscape in a particular way, but also for articulating that experience. And so much language came with and out of the tracking that I think also we've both been really enjoying and using. And it's not language that either of us, I think, would have arrived at or have had access to if we hadn't done that practical training. John uses concepts like working the wheel, and talks about spokes that you walk along when you're trying to assess which direction a deer might have taken in the forest. There are track traps, there's browse, there's this whole vocabulary of very detailed and sensory, but also quite sort of diagrammatic and formal language,
quite fun
language practice.
That's I think what's really beguiling. Like, it's quite sassy and sort of like lively language. And when he talks about being on a red hot trail, and like the fluffiness of a deer slot, like the mark that its hoof makes in the mud.
Talk about the fluffiness.
So that's how when you're looking at tracks, time is very important, of course, because you want to know how recently the animal has been in the place and has made that mark, because that gives you a better chance of finding it. And so fluffiness relates to how fresh the imprint is, and there's literally this sense of the energy that's still in the mark. And the fluffiness is like, you start to be able to really see by spending a lot of time looking at mud, literally learning this language of mud, which is, for me, I think we both found that so sublime, paying so much attention to something which is, even for years of learning about plants, is kind of just like the thing that sits beneath it suddenly becomes a text in and of itself, and you're learning to read these marks like some kind of mysterious rune that is revealing information, and it's marvelous. I mean, it's so mysterious. And
right, like you say, it's like a language of energy. That's such a good way to describe it, and very literally. It is amazing how much you can extract from one print. I mean, if you have a set of prints, fantastic, but from one impression in the ground. And yeah, sometimes it's described as reading a language of pressure release or as energy tracking, that you can actually observe not only the species and perhaps the age and the gender of an animal, but like the mode in which it was acting and thinking when it hit the ground, based on what sort of dispersed energy there is in the soil around that imprint. You can almost read the thoughts of the animal off the tracks that are left, or you can if you're a seasoned tracker. So the fact that this is something we're learning to do, which actually gets us perhaps as close as is humanly possible to the minds of other animals, for me, is just, that is such an opening and such an opportunity, and that is a language which you can read from the forest floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes you start asking questions of animals, the track, and reading the track of, well, what, there's those sort of core questions which we're so used to asking about our human lives, and particularly in terms of writing, like, well, what happened here? Why did this happen? Where does it go? Like, who, what, when, where, why? Those classic questions. And that's what you're suddenly asking of a piece of ground, and this otherwise, like, this tiny mark that you might otherwise just step over or just tread over, right, and get rid of, because you imprint your own human footprint on top. And suddenly, by paying that attention, you start to build this picture of this animal and this animal's experience, and you start to journey into what it must be like to be them. So there's kind of two things that happen. One, you're going deeper into what it must be like to be an animal, which takes us out of our human-centric mode of being. And you're also giving yourself the tools to ask better questions of yourself. And I think that's what's been so interesting, is as a mode of inquiry, tracking, you can use it for many different things. And I think we talked about that in our conversation last night, but you can start to track your own experience much more subtly, and energy tracking, particularly, like where are these things happening in my body, and where are they going? And yeah, it's a sort of detective work, because it's so subtle and it's so quiet.
Yeah, that's such a good way of putting it. And trackers often refer to it as reading the story, reading the tracking story.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess if you think about it, like, absolutely everything, every mark that you see in the world is a track of something. It's an imprint of something having happened. And so there is this transferability between being able to track animals, read and diagnose animal behavior through their tracks, but also just to form a different mode, like you say, of attentiveness, which enables you to do that kind of reading wherever you are, and pay that sort of attention to many different things, which is such a gift, such a beautiful thing to be able to carry with you.
It really is. And it reminds me of that lovely practice that we did together when Hermione and I were together. There were roe deer here in the garden where I'm living. And so we decided we were watching them through the windows, and they were browsing in the garden. So we decided to go out and follow their tracks, but rather than reading the ground where they'd been stepping, we were following their browse lines, and so began to form a map of their movements through the plants that they were eating, and seeing what they had taken and where their little nibble marks were. And actually then took some of those plants and brought them inside and made a distillation of a kind of roe browse essence, which was this beautiful smelling kind of elixir of what we'd watched those deer eat that day. And it was it was just such a precious moment for me in terms of bridging the relationship between tracking and foraging, and seeing how, again, you're mapping your environment in a different way by paying attention to the way the animal is engaging with their environment. And again, we weren't choosing the plants that were for us, we were choosing plants that they would choose for them. And just another lovely way into experiencing being alive.
Yeah, I think that's a really maybe a great place to like leap off this trail and segue over to last night's trail. We began by yesterday both going out on a tracking walk and then sharing our experiences. So should we sign off here now? And yes. Yeah, so okay, so what we thought we would do is set ourselves a task today just to go out and follow something, to track something, and use that as a way to begin our conversation. And I've just gotten in from a really beautiful walk on it feels like one of the first days of spring, very locally, just like out the back of my house, actually, where we went walking together tomorrow when you were here last, around the fields. Without a particular tracking objective in mind, I thought I'd just begin and then see what presented itself as worthy of attention.
And what did you find on your trail?
It was really noisy. I was like trying to cast aside the bird song, and they're just going haywire. Like, so much bird activity at the moment. It feels like everything's waking up around here. And it's been late afternoon, so the sun was quite low, but there just seemed to be like a ton of nesting activity. So I basically followed the sounds around and walked incredibly slowly through this very beautiful footpath with hedgerows either side that join up at the top. Just sort of walked through this funnel of bird activity and kept my ears pricked. That's how I began. How about you?
That's so sweet, because I essentially was on the same trail up here in Scotland, because and as I said to you, I had an intention to try and track the signs of spring that are coming, because I'm desperately in need of it to arrive. And the bird song was the thing that caught my attention. And I was in a quite small cemetery on the edge of the village here. And the thing that was interesting was this split I felt in my attention between the sounds of the birds, which was, oh, my son's bird at the window. Good timing. The sound of the birds, and then the sound of the human traffic that was really quite noisy. And I haven't actually been into the village for a while. And it was an interesting moment because I needed to choose which one I was going to focus my attention on. And when I focused into the birds, it was really interesting feeling the other fade away, even though it was far louder and in a sense more aggressive and disjointed than the sound of the birds. And so I kind of, these two different song lines were presenting themselves, one human and one bird, and I chose the bird trail. And even within this little pocket of a cemetery, had that amazing feeling of being taken momentarily into their kind of delicate world and following them around from tree to tree.
Something that I've noticed when I go out, and today I just follow the path which I tend to follow, like when I don't have much else on a daily basis, local to here. It doesn't matter to what degree I'm attempting to focus my attention on bird song or deer tracks or any number of other things. Whenever there's a human presence nearby, it totally occupies and takes over center stage, and I have to try incredibly hard not to be overtaken by the presence of people who I'm passing. I always become very sort of self-conscious and aware of the fact that I'm walking very slowly, or sort of might appear like a sort of monster in the bushes to people who are walking by, and yeah, and they kind of capture my attention. It's hard to mediate that and like stay with the tracking when there are other people. Particularly, there aren't very many people around, so you come across someone and their presence is very dominant. But maybe that's just a reaction to, and also, I mean, it's probably a very social human thing, but could also be a reaction to the presence of another animal, predatory animal body, sort of big presence humans carry around with them, noisy, make sounds, heavy footfall sounds when they're moving along a path or through the undergrowth. So it's quite hard, I find, to ignore human beings when I'm doing this.
Yeah, it is. I find the same. And it's interesting noticing how heavy our own human being is when you're on the trail and you're wanting to become the animal that you're following or that you're tracking or you're trying to enter into this relationship with, and how clunky our bodies can suddenly become in an outside space, and habitually how heavily we move and the way we plod or crash and talk. And I think there was again this interesting moment of I was recording the amazing sound of this bird, and then was talking about the experience of how important it was to try and tune into listening to this bird, and was aware that my voice was fighting with the birds, and I was actually scared, and I then was talking so much I think it heard me and it flew away. And so this part of this journey is how to make yourself quiet, and that is how to quieten our minds, how to quieten our mouths, our bodies, everything. And it's surprisingly hard. Like, we are loud beings, we're just so used to smashing about.
That's so true. Yeah, I went in a similar direction because I was focused on the birds. I did actually something that I tend to do anyway when I go that route, which is to try and walk incredibly quietly up to a cornfield where I know that there are a number of pigeons, wood pigeons, who like to feed, I think, on the corn in that field. And like generally I sort of march up to it and then kick myself because the pigeons like splash up and rustle their feathers, and so I try and remember to like approach that field really, really quietly and see how far into it I can get before disturbing them. I've noticed this about birds, like the pigeons tend to be the ones that will fly off first. I don't know why, but they tend to be like the most, I think, sort of sensitive or bothered about human presence. I was really proud of myself this time, so I got all the way into the cornfield, and there was no pigeon rustle at all. But then I started making some sound and I realised that there weren't any pigeons, probably because of the time of day. So that was some false pride. But it got me thinking about like exactly what you're saying, the sort of like the ripple effect that our presence has in the world as we move through it. And I started to wonder how you could begin to experience that effect that you have on the world, because when we're moving through it, we're always sort of at the center of that ripple, so we don't acknowledge what is changing because of our presence. But I was imagining like placing a microphone in the middle of the field, leaving it on for hours, disappearing, and then coming back, and just being able to listen to that sort of sound shadow, in a sense, that like emerges around you when you interrupt or join in with an existing ecology. And the fact that sound itself seems like the way, in a sense, to begin to examine yeah, like how we fit into or disrupt or interact as a presence with all the other presences around us in the land.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thought that there is, that we're being listened to as much as we're listening for something, and that sense of being beheld by these often invisible creatures in a way that we can't really imagine. And that as we move through our experience, like you say, we're at the center of it, so we can't really imagine how we're being perceived, but that ability, that the way in which tracking invites you to think about how you are appearing in the world, how you are presenting, and the impact your presence is having is such a beautiful shift, because it's not about language, it's not about what you're saying to someone, and it's not about appearance, like whether you look good or not. It's just about how loud you're being in the space, like how you are appearing as human. And in a sense, I guess we don't know how we appear to animals. We can only really imagine, which I guess is an interesting question. When we're tracking, are we trying to become an animal, or are we wanting to be a human who's really good at being a quiet human, like a really good hunter? Like, which one are we trying to achieve? And I guess I don't really ask myself that often.
Yeah, what you said about the importance of learning to be quiet seems really important, and the fact that quieting is like very physical in terms of like the noise that you're making as you move, but also like a need to be internally very quiet, and that somehow there's this is something that I think I've started to become aware of, that I'm learning through the tracking, is that there's this really profound relationship between internal state of being and external state of being, in terms of how you are read by and seen by, witnessed by the surrounding wildlife. And it reminds me of something that our friend Jeff spoke about when we were out with him in where were we?
In Devon.
In Devon, thank you. He said that when he is watching or stalking, he often imagines that he's something like a log. He imagines that he is a very quiet, inanimate object. And what that does is like shrinks. In his description, it shrinks this sort of bubble of affect that surrounds him in the world all the way down until he feels very quiet, and he senses that from another perspective, he's almost imperceptible. And I just I haven't got my head around this, but I absolutely love the idea that like turning yourself into a log, like hypnotizing yourself into feeling like you're something inanimate and very quiet, might have that effect and might actually literally make you almost invisible. That quieting, it's an action of quieting. And then how you actually get there, I mean, how you begin to convince yourself you're a log, or the way you have to train and tame and calm your internal monologue and your thoughtscape to get close to being in that quiet space, is that's like a whole, I mean, we should have that conversation maybe, because there are different techniques and things that we've both been learning about and beginning to practice, which are really helpful on that level. Yeah,
really helpful. And I think, you know, we both talked about this, of the tangible experience of going out tracking and feeling this busyness and this loudness inside, and then because you go into that place of silent attention and then often a lot of stillness, so that you can see the thing that's moving, you know, see the animal that's, it's interesting that you need to be still often to see the thing that's moving. So you have to just slow down, by the time you come out and you come back to the human world, which is often lit up and kind of bright, this winter it has been anyway, because you've been out where it's dark, and then you come back into this very different space. You carry that with you inside. And it's an incredibly precious, feeling, full of magic. And it's so hard to put into words. And it's such a fascinating thing, the way we talk about it, because we both are sharing that experience either together or separately. But it's something that we can talk about, but you only get there by not talking. And so it's that journey into silence is such a profound one. There's so much that's out there that is, it feels like you're tapping into something really vast and really precious. And yeah, the modes for stilling that busyness inside, I think it's interesting. That's become more and more interesting to me as a kind of necessity of how can I learn to be still inside so that I can go out and, as you say, emanate something that will allow for closer contact. So I've found that the breath is such an important one, and slowing one's breathing down. And again, not speaking helps so much with that, because you realize that quick, stressed pace that you go in with. And then when you slow it down, you start to just tune into a very different rhythm.
It's so true. And I feel like it's worth acknowledging also at this moment that we are on Zoom and that both of us are incredibly Zoom phobic. And then we entered this conversation knowing that we were pre-recording, but also with palpitating hearts. Having tried to trick ourselves into occupying an alternative mode by going tracking first, but still feeling like we've fallen into a bit of this trap of being thrown back against ourselves, like hyper aware, hyper self-conscious, because we're in the screen mode now. It's like we're always dancing in between. I mean, it's interesting to think about, trying to prepare yourself to go out so that you enter the out in an appropriate mode, as it were. But also for me, I think often just needing to go out in order to be able to access that mode in the first place. And we've been working on, we started our tracking course together and trained relatively intensively winter 2019, right? Yeah. So it's been a little while, but I think it's only really been since maybe just this last winter lockdown, in a sense, like living alone here in Yorkshire, that I have fully recognised what it means to be trying to learn to track, and how it might, if I continue to practice it and take it seriously and sort of rhythmatize this relationship with it, how profoundly helpful actually it can be. Because I had this incredibly depressed week after New Year. In the UK, everything was suddenly cancelled. We got right up to the brink of Christmas, and then suddenly a new lockdown was imposed. And so everything that we've been looking forward to was just wiped clean off the slate, and we were left very much alone, a lot of us. And I just had a very, very dark week in the aftermath of a non-New Year. And it was only after I sort of made a pact with myself to go out every day and started, very rhythmically tracking, that I came out of it and felt like, it just totally changed my mental landscape. Just seems important to note that there is seems like there's a profound, maybe we're having this conversation now because there is a profound relationship between mental well-being and health and this work. And that's not why I was drawn towards it in the first instance. I wasn't thinking about it on that register at all. But it's certainly there.
I think it's, I was thinking about this today, looking at a bird, and I couldn't discern which one it was. And I realized I felt the lack of knowledge I have still about birds and how much there is to learn. And then felt like that, wow, still about tracking in general. Like I feel like such a novice on the trail. And we've talked about this and how, like, you know, shy making that can be, in a sense, when you talk about it with other people, because you feel like can you even really say that this is a part of your life when we're still so kind of green and learning about it. But there's something so important and healthy, it feels to me, in particularly in this time where everything feels so baffling, to engage in a practice where you really don't know what you're doing, and it's constantly hedged in uncertainty and questions, and it's only ever leading into deeper mystery, and you often don't find the thing you're looking for, and you don't even know if you want to find the thing you're looking for, because often that means disturbing it from its resting place anyway. And so you're just on this path and you're following signs, and it can so often feel like you're just being mad. Like, what am I doing out here? Just staring at mud and really not feeling like I'm in the driving seat even of this experience, and like I don't know what I'm doing. And yet coming back and feeling so much better, like you say, and feeling peaceful and feeling like I'm part of something glorious, and that I don't understand, and that's okay, but I'm in it and I feel it in me. It just feels such a glorious way to learn, and so not the way we're taught learning should be.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I mean, I guess there are the obvious, like, health benefits of being able to reach a place of calm and be in the great outdoors a lot, which, you know, is as a part of this. But yeah, like, maybe that is more so why I think this feels really good to me at the moment. It's that I've landed on a trail of practice which links to so many of the things that I'm interested in, but also just feels good enough to feel worth pursuing. And it is a trail which feels endless, and like we've been talking about, when we're finally able to you know, traveling to other parts of the world to like pick up new tracking knowledge and, you know, follow different species of animal, and it seems like it's just such a long, slow, and like you say, like humbling pursuit. And I suppose with all of the pandemic nonsense going on, like, it is such a landscape of uncertainty that we've been inhabiting, like decisively entering another landscape of uncertainty, but one that we feel like we can dance with, and one that feels like it's feeding us somehow, is perhaps also like a very relevant activity, and feels like sort of good agility training in a way, for the messy world at large. I don't know if that's part of it.
Yeah, and I think there's a coherence to what's out there, that hasn't been created by humans, that's so different to the human world, which just feels so fractured and chaotic at times. And there's something soothing in sensing that you're joining a trail of things that exist around our human experience, that go on without our interference, that don't need us. Like, we're humbled. You're there as a guest, and you're not a guest. Like, we belong there too, but we've forgotten how to be there, how to be out there. And so you're kind of, I don't know, I find that as well really important for my mind, which once has been taught that it should own things and own understanding, and to go into that place of not knowing, and just humbly follow. it's so beautiful on a track because you're following an animal. The animal's ahead. The animal's the one that's blazed the trail. You're behind, following, rather than us being in charge. And again, it's just so wonderful. It's like when a dog's on a lead. I love that the dog's leading the way. Like, it's the one pulling the human along.
It's not how we think about leads, but that is how it generally operates. Yeah, it's so true. Like, we're following them, and that therefore means that they are ultimately the leader and the teacher. And I think I'm doing a PhD at the moment. I have an academic cohort, and obviously there are all of these conversations that we're both involved in to different degrees, like around animal studies and like how to intellectualize and philosophize around our human relationship to nature. And yet it always, like, I often feel this sort of slightly skin crawly sense of the crustiness of those conversations, because they feel all around the edges of the experience of actually speaking to the subjects that we're trying to elevate to to the level of subjectivity or rethink somehow. Like, there are so many conversations swirling around that are attempting to address how we might begin to reposition ourselves vis-a-vis the non-human world. What happens when you go out? Like, perhaps you do move away from a human-centric world because you're following the trails of non-humans, but also you get to see all of these sort of interesting edge lands where a human landscape bleeds into a non-human world. You see the way that animals are negotiating hedgerows, which were planted a couple hundred years ago to dissect fields into plots to rearrange the land and to rearrange land ownership in this country. And it's often those hedgerows themselves that are home to the holes and tunnels and worlds of the other animals. And it's really fun rereading even like brick walls, fences, like the boundaries around people's gardens, like rereading that very human landscape with an attention to the way that it's being utilized and often like negated and abused or rethought by its non-human inhabitants. And that's really fun. Like, the tracks don't stop where the forest ends. They run all over the place, and they run all the way in. And I guess that we've had all these lovely conversations also around the fact that tracking is a sort of transposable practice or method, and you don't have to necessarily go out tracking animals. You can track all sorts of things. You can track spring, or you can track your own gut, or rethink drawing and recognize that even the practice of observational drawing is a sort of tracking on a micro scale. It's such a sort of fluid language, I suppose.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it does feel it's a mode of inquiry, and I think that's the thing that's become the most not useful in the sense of it even having a kind of something that I want it to do, but as a form of attention, as a way of looking at the world and a way of becoming aware of how I move through the world. It's incredibly useful because it's just really about really acute noticing, like, and what we pay our attention to is what we build the world out of. And I think that's the thing we've lost. We see the world only from a human point of view often, especially when we've brought up in urban like an urban environment, as I was. And I love, exactly like you say, those guerrilla paths of noticing the way animals are moving through these sort of liminal spaces at the edges of our human paths or where we live and our houses. I remember someone saying to me once that, talking about deer, he said, deer know much more about us than we know about them. And that's why you rarely see them. Like, there are masses of deer, to some people, to the point where they would call them vermin, which is to me, problematic descriptor, but they're there everywhere. And yet when we see one, we're still like, oh, it's magic. We've seen a deer. And so they know where we are. They know how we move. They've recognized and learned our human patterns. And yet when we, for us starting to learn about deer, it feels like there's so much to learn. Like, what are these creatures and how do they live? And that just blew my mind when I suddenly thought, wow, we're being witnessed by these animals all the time. They know about us. And it's just kind of wild that not to have that dual awareness all the time, for it to be such a leap, to be like, oh, how are we perceived by the other beings around us?
Hey everyone, this is David chiming in here. I think we'll stay with the walkout for just another moment, but I invite you at this time to start thinking about questions you might have for Hermione and tomorrow. Write them in the chat. I have a question to get us started for tomorrow, Hermione. I can see you tomorrow. I can see you in the video on my side screen. Can you just nod that you can hear me okay?
David, your sound is a little low.
Sounds low. Is this better? Awesome. So I have a question to get us started as folks are thinking of their questions. Tamara and Hermione, first of all, thank you. What an extraordinary and generative video and talk. Thank you so much for putting this together. Such rich terrain. Wow. The question I have is about encounter. Encountering the being that perhaps made the trail. I'm curious to know about your individual experiences of encounter, if indeed, upon reading the recent history of an animal's movements, you found yourself in their present. And I wonder if you feel that this mode of readerly or tracking attention could be construed as preparation for an encounter with another being.
That's a good question. I'll give my abbreviated answer, and maybe Tamara can expand a bit. I am no way near good enough at animal tracking at this stage to have any confidence in my ability to approach an animal with an encounter in mind. It almost seems like the more you track, the further away they get. When we were beginning this, we started our training, we expected we'd be seeing deer every day, and then it took the first full hour of not leaving sight of the car park to realize that we probably weren't going to get there in the couple of months that we were spending learning the ropes of this thing. Sometimes the encounters happen on accident, and then you can enjoy claiming them, but you know in your deepest heart that it wasn't due to your tracking skills. But then I suppose there's another kind of encounter, which is just the kind of assemblage of the other that you get by reading the land in this way. And that is of value regardless, which is, I think, probably why we keep going. Otherwise, it might just seem like too mammoth a pursuit. But I know that Tamara has spent some time with deer stalkers up in Scotland. And I mean, likewise, in the company of other people who are incredibly skilled at this sort of practice. We've both had encounters, sort of secondary encounters, and I don't know, Tamara, if you want to talk a little bit about the deer.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing where the process of tracking intersects with that of hunting, really. And of course, the skill of tracking, all of the skills of tracking were developed in line with hunting, with that desire eventually to meet the animal. Usually with the idea of a kill in mind, so that there's food to eat. And so, which is another type of very close relating. That is another way of we engage with the animal world, but it's one that's quite confronting and it contains violence and death. So it's strange because in terms of tracking, the idea of encounter is such a gentle meeting to get good and quiet enough that you can stalk in and look at an animal in its resting place without disturbing it. But the aim of tracking where it's linked with hunting is that you're getting close enough, and by coming in close enough, becoming animal enough, you will be the cause of that animal's end. And so there's a sort of shift, in a huge shift in that, and a lot of sorrow actually. And I think that's one of the things I've found hardest, is feeling that growing kinship with an animal and like you're really on their side, and then getting into a place of intimacy and then watching that animal be killed. So it's been very, very hard and quite sad in that way. So I really value the idea of prolonging our skill, like getting better at our skills, so that you can have those tender moments of just watching for the sake of watching. And I think tracking is absolutely a practice that can and should be engaged with just for that sake, in and of its own sake, without it needing to be involved with hunting. Yeah.
Stop the share now. That's a wonderful answer, and I feel like it maps on to experiences of reading as well, or maybe some ideals we have about learning. In reading a text, I think perhaps one might say the wrong way to go about it is to begin reading. Oop, the video's starting again behind. With the intent of mastering the knowledge, to having a sort of closing encounter as opposed to an opening encounter with a text or with a writer, etc. And it seems like, yeah, the place we actually want to get is to have an opening encounter with that text, to not limit its possibilities in our readership, but to open it up. I wonder, Tamara, to ask you another question. Sorry, Sal, do you mind? Has that disposition sort of affected your writing at all?
The experience of watching animals being killed through the process of tracking, yes, it definitely did, because I think you can think about the process of death a lot, you can theorize about it, but until you actually watch and take part in that sense in an animal being killed, it remains something that you're quite abstracted from. But in taking part in it, there's a kind of a seriousness and an engagement with the sacred that asks for a much deeper engagement with the writing. I think I thought I could glibly skip over things, and I realized that I can't. And I think that's why it's taking so long. And I'm partly having doubts if I can even really write about it properly, because I still I haven't fully absorbed it into my own experience, I suppose. So yeah, it definitely has changed it.
Sal, would you like to ask your question?
Well, I saw there was one in the chat. Maybe we'll field the chat question first.
Definitely. The questioner asks, I can say this aloud, or of course, folks are welcome to open up their mics and join the conversation. Do you have a preference? Got it. Okay, so here we have a question. Stalking tracking seems to me a dual way of learning. What have the deer taught you about the rules of engagement? I imagine there is some permission from both parties. This sounds so strange to say / write. The encounter seems also to be about a register of intent from you and the deer.
Mm. You want to start with that, Hermione?
I'm thinking about it. I mean, I think in terms of deer encounter in particular, you've had much more experience than me. And we should also acknowledge the presence of Jeff McMullen in this chat, who we mentioned in the conversation, and who is a teacher of ours and a close friend of Tamara's. So welcome, Jeff. And if you want to chip in at any stage, because you are probably the most, without doubt, the most experienced tracker amongst us, then please do. Yeah, no, I'm going to think about this one for a while. Do you have anything to say, Tamara?
I think, if I've understood the question correctly, the idea of intent is interesting. I think it feels as though sometimes you're I've asked questions of whether you're welcome on the trail, and it can sometimes feel like an imposition. And certainly when you're clumsily learning, you're constantly disturbing the deer. You're moving them from their resting place. And so it sometimes feels as though, even though there's this desire to reach a state of kinship and to shed some of our humanity and become more deer, you're always pushing them further away from you. And that doesn't feel like an easy thing that's agreed upon. And certainly not when it comes to hunting. It definitely doesn't feel as though they want to be found. So yeah, again, that's something that's a little bit troubling. It remains a question. If I understood the question the right way. Sorry if I've just gone off on a wild tangent.
I think asking permission is a good practice, whether you're asking permission in a way that is legible to the deer or in a way just of yourself to feel like this is an appropriate thing to be engaging with. It's helpful. And I think that your question is fascinating because it also raises other interesting questions around the way that intention registers in a physical way through your body and your bodily presence, but in incredibly subtle ways that perhaps we're attuned to, but we don't recognize, and other animals might be more actively responsive to. And so there's always this feeling that perhaps they're almost psychic in their capacity to respond incredibly quickly or assess the situation. But it could just be that when your heart is beating heavy, or you're sort of hyper self-conscious, or you're not conscious at all and you're just sort of, you know, going about with your normal human body language and so forth, you are sending out messages that you don't realize. And so again, I think in that sense, like then intent becomes a kind of bodily awareness, and part of this practice in that sense. Mm. Jeff, do you have anything to say to any of that? Or
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I'm acutely aware that this is your show, not mine. That question that's been asked is a really good question, because there's a lot of stuff in there. So if you imagine a still pond and you drop a stone into it, you get all the ripples. And that's what you're doing when you enter into nature. You're creating a series of concentric rings. Now, if you let the stone drop gently, the ripples won't be so big. But if you pick up a rock and let the rock drop into the water, you're going to create waves. So your intent kicks in as well. What is your intent for being in there? And they will know long before you do that you're there, you know. So for me, it's about connecting with the environment and with the animals. So you introduce yourself just like you would do a person. You say hello, you shake hands, you do the same in the animal world. And you let them know why you're there, what your intent is, and they will accommodate you. They are very curious about you. I can give one example. I had a client, he was doing a sit spot. I got him to do a sit spot and I went off. And he just had to sit there and get out of his head and just be really quiet. It's like a kind of meditation. I went off about a mile away, picked up a stick, walked into the forest and visualized myself as a hunter holding a gun. I spoke to a young female red deer. She took off in the opposite direction from me. And his job while he was in the sit spot was to watch what the birds were telling him about where I was in the forest, because the birds will always tell you first, you know. They have particular calls for humans, like our blackbird or your American robin. It'll have a call for a blue jay. It'll have a particular call for a bobcat, and so on. So you can actually tell the subtle differences. So anyway, she turned up at his position about 5 meters from where he was sat. And when I got to him, I said, so what did the birds tell you? He said, never mind the birds, let me tell you about this deer. She arrived, she stood there and she looked at him. Now, if you imagine, you know, like on your stereo, when you get the light show going up and down to the sound, right? When you do a meditation, everybody's like that at the beginning. All their energies are up and down, depending on how they present. But when you get into a kind of group meditation, that balances out. The strong supply the weak with a bit of energy and vice versa. So she stood there and looked at him for a couple of minutes. She couldn't work out who he was because he wasn't behaving like a human being does. Through the forest, dogs running loose, barking, shouting, throwing stuff, snapping sticks or whatever. And eventually she walked up to him and she touched his nose with her snout. Yeah. And then I saw her coming back the other way, going off to my left. And when he told me that, I just sat there, I went, I didn't swear, but I wanted to swear. You're so lucky. You know, she didn't know who he was, but she kind of worked out from his energy and his intent that things were okay, and she connected with him on that level. It's like when you meet somebody, you don't speak to them, you don't have a word with them, but you know you don't like them because you're picking up on their energy. And we do that all the time. We've just forgotten how to do it. You know, so that's a really important question. You know, there's a lot in there. Yeah, it is an agreement. I tell the trees I've arrived, and it's nice to see them all, and I'll touch a tree and maybe hug a tree. I'm 6'4" and I'm an ex-soldier, so that freaks a few people out. There's so many things involved there, you know. So, but I love the thing that you said about the worm instructs the mole and the mole instructs the tracker. I like that. It's a really, really good. I might adopt that if I may.
You're welcome to.
I think I've answered the question. Yes, I always ask for permission. So it's like greeting, hello, around. It is a two-way thing, and it is definitely about intent. They will know whether you're there for good or bad. And if they know you're there for bad, you won't see them for love nor money.
There are very specific physical things when you're attempting to get close to an animal. Something that a pest control friend of mine mentioned comes to mind, that if you're trying to catch a hare, and say you can do this with your bare hands if you're incredibly skilled, you need to walk towards it, but not directly towards it, and spiral in, but never look at it directly, because if the hare perceives you looking at it, it will immediately register that as threatening intent and will bolt. But you can actually get incredibly close just by...
And lower your silhouette. The closer you get, bring your silhouette down. Because to the rabbit or the hare, you look like you're miles away still.
Nice.
Yeah, it's good advice.
It's amazing. Sal, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think maybe you could say it follows on from the worm instructs the mole instructs the tracker. Who does the tracker instruct? You know, in the sense of you describe so beautifully the education of attention that you experienced in learning to do this and in continuing the practice, and that brings to mind the anthropologist Timothy Ingold, who I'm sure you guys know, and James Gibson originated that phrase, the education of attention, to describe learning to see what the landscape affords you, what are the possibilities in the situation that you're in, not just what are its like geometric features, but what are its features that you might be able to interact with. But I'm curious to know, you know, if noticing in this way has affected noticing in some other way in your life.
I mean, the first answer would be, I feel like the animal tracker could be teaching more people than they currently are, which is kind of the underpinnings of my current PhD research, which I guess I'm hoping will act as a sort of bridge between the people who practice like this and a much broader community of people who just aren't aware of the fact that one could begin to engage with the non-human world through this language, through this skill set in a very practical way. So I think it's a great education for academics. and yeah, all sorts is changing in this process in terms of I mean, it's interesting because David and Sally, we know each other through a community who are focused on exploring different ways of practicing attention, and particularly attention to non-humans, not just animals, but non-humans in the broader sense. And there are lots of overlaps between the animal tracking and the attentional practices that we have been exploring. It calms me down a lot. I've learned a lot about the specificity of knowledge in relationship to place, both through practice and also talking to my pest control friends who say, you know, I read a book on moles and then I I couldn't trap moles anymore because the book got stuck in my head. And the book was written in the south of England, but he's based up here in the north in Yorkshire. And none of that knowledge was smoothly transferable, and it actually kept tripping him up and stopping him from doing his more sort of embodied ongoing work that he was used to and quite successful at. And so he had to go through this process of sort of exorcising the mole book from his head before he could get on. So yeah, I guess it asks, raises more questions as well, just in terms of how then I articulate and share this PhD research as well, because part of that is a written dissertation. And this work does put a lot of pressure on language, I think, to operate in a way that remains tethered to the body and tethered to place. You almost have to do this kind of elastic work with language, a bit like the elastic work that hunters do when they're trying to communicate with other animals in order to capture the essence of what's going on and talk about it pragmatically. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. This is a really interesting topic. So I'll digress a little bit. I had a German friend who'd done his doctorship in ornithology, 10-year study at the year 9, he was studying tree pipit. At the year 9, tree pipit did something he'd never seen before, which threw his thesis right out the window. So what he did, he ignored it, finished his last year, got his doctorship, waited 6 months, and then wrote a paper on new behavior in tree pipit discovered by Dr. so-and-so, so-and-so. So my question would be, if you had to write that book about the mole now, knowing what you know, would you, because we're going back to who instructs who, yeah, what that Sal was posing earlier. I think I'll keep it in the eye. I think if I wanted to write about a mole, I might say, okay, mole, what would you like me to tell about you that the others need to understand? And then watch and listen. I mean, is that something that you would consider if you had to write or rewrite the book or revise it? Is that an approach that might be of interest or curiosity? Because then the mole's instructing you about what it needs to get out there for us to understand it.
Yeah,
with the bird analogy, with the bird analogy, he's putting a human perspective onto the tree pipit. You know, it's like Flipper or Skippy. What's that, Skippy? He's fallen down a well and broken a leg, and all Skippy's doing is going. Yeah. Sorry. I'm Irish. I'll talk the hind legs off a donkey, as the girls know.
No, I was just going to say, Jeff, I would, yeah, I would absolutely do that. I would probably begin the book on moles by quoting you from this conversation, giving me that advice, and then use that as an ins into perhaps like a series of protocols for how to begin to execute this learning. I mean, one of the interesting things that I know Tamara's been finding this too, that has happened over the last 6 months or so, is that I actually haven't been able to do very much in-person field research at all, which is a bit problematic for someone who's based in an anthropology department. So I have just been going out walking a lot by myself, but slightly worrying in a sense. But on the other hand, in fact, that is how I know that you've learned, and how a lot of my other teachers have learned themselves, just by direct engagement and observation. So it actually seems like a fortunate, unfortunate situation to have been landed in, and I will be writing about that, or like, yeah, honouring that and working it into the outcome of this research. But I also get to make an exhibition as well as write a book for this project, which is wonderful. It's actually practice-based research, so it doesn't have to all get tied into an academic dissertation, thank goodness.
Yeah. I got told a great story when I worked in rehab by one of the clients. They had a major problem with moles in their garden, and her husband tried everything, poison, traps, everything that was on the market he tried, and he couldn't get rid of them. And in the end, he had had enough one day. He picked up his rake, he stormed out into the garden, dragged the rake through the ground and drew a line in the soil, and he went, right, you lot on that side and don't come back. Never had a mole problem after that. They got the message.
This talk's going to go viral now that you said that. But Tamara, you're the one that's writing the book currently. I mean, you've been, last 2 years, you've been researching all of this, and experimenting with different forms and wondering how to fit this like broad exploration into something that is happy as a book.
Yeah, it's just an ever unfolding trail at this point. It just feels like it keeps going. It doesn't seem to want to end, and it does sometimes feel like a book or a text is a fixed ending. It's like this is somehow now contained. And we talked about this, Hermione, how even recording this conversation, in the process of talking about tracking, we were learning new things about the process of tracking. And so we've left this recorded conversation behind us, and this is the thing that's now being sort of saved. And to do that with a book just at this point doesn't feel right. It feels like something that is still unfolding. And I think the challenge of these days of being out alone and following our trails without the guidance of the teachers that we were working alongside is this process of discernment. How do you start to trust your own inner guidance and inner knowing in relation to the marks and the tracks and the things you're seeing on the trail, and my relationship as a human being to these animals without having clear guidance? It starts to feel like something that's born much more of intuition and your own like navigation system, which is something so important. And I think something that's quite undermined in our culture is the sort of the power of intuition. But it will be really nice to root that back to the clear guidance of the evidence-based trail of, well, this is very clearly that, and this is that. And for that, you really do need a teacher. So it's probably good to have this time of seasoning the mystery, and then it will be good to root it back into the ground.
I have to say that as a reader, I'm hotly anticipating these books, these texts, when they come to fruition. This has been totally fascinating. I think maybe at this point, we'll have, it looks like we have one more question in the chat, and then we'll maybe wind down. Although I think if this group ever wanted to reconvene, I think it'd be amazing to continue the conversation. But we have one question from Dylan. Dylan, do you want to read, or would you like me to read it?
I can read it. So just first, thank you all for the conversation. Really interesting stuff. Hermione, at one point you mentioned the crustiness of conversations in like an animal studies or an academic context. And I think we all know what you're talking about there. It gets a little hairy and weird as you start to talk about things that are so embodied and also so complex in a way that can be reduced down into a theory kind of situation. And that I'm reminded of that deer browse tincture that you guys talked about as a kind of metaphor for that, reducing down like this complexity into something that's more pure and can kind of be moved around. And I guess my real question is, compared to that complexity, something like an art exhibit or a academic paper could almost seem beside the point. And I just wonder how you think about bridging that gap for both of you in your work to have these intense embodied experiences dealing with all this complexity while also feeling this need, or do you feel the need to transform that into something that's communicable to someone that's not you or not involved in that world?
Yeah, I mean, one answer would be, well, if after doing this year of field research, academia does feel entirely beside the point, I'll put it down because I'd be just as happy to segue into a different community and community of teachers, and continue if that's the most appropriate. But then perhaps that's a bit of a cop out. I don't know. I think and another way to answer the question would be that there are various kind of reductions that occur in the field, as it were, in terms of the objects that hunters and trappers make when they're trying to communicate with other animals. And this is what I'm really excited by in terms of the work that the people who work in pest control I'm spending time with at the moment produce and make use of, things like lures and decoys and traps. And these objects themselves are incredibly good at condensing sort of ecological knowledge and an understanding of how human-on-human relationships work, and sort of they're objects that are made to perform this role of negotiating between perspectives. And so what I would love to be able to make and share as a result of this work are art forms which function in an equivalent way to sort of operate on a human and a non-human audience both at once, and therefore create a kind of entanglement of perspectives in that sense and do some similar work. But it's tricky because yeah, like there's this beautiful, the banner image for this talk is it's a lure that my falconer friend uses to train his eagles, and it's a substitute roe deer. Effectively, it's made out of roe deer fur. He attaches a chick to it, and he uses an amazing mechanized machine which flings the lure across a field so that it moves very quickly, so that the eagle recognizes it and learns how to fly back to him. And yeah, I just really, I get a lot from thinking about how those objects come to be made and how they operate, what they do. And yeah, it's almost like already perfect, the lure machine. So maybe the work will be a documentation of those objects shared. Maybe it will be a production of things that work similarly, or an analog to those objects themselves. Tamara.
I think it's interesting. I mean, writing is what took me really further deeper into devoting a lot of time to researching this, but it's become secondary. And it's not at all that it's impossible to write about it, but it's definitely asking to find a form of writing that is deeply engaged with mystery and somehow asking more questions than presenting any certainty. And I think I've been working with the form of a novel, and that's slightly problematic because that's sort of, it asks for a mastery that doesn't feel fitting here. So I'm not sure, it sort of feels like language is getting moved around and opened up, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to take shape, but I'm so grateful to have found this, and it's become a deeply embedded practice and part of life. And yeah, whether or not it ends up with a satisfying text, it's a really important thing to have found.
Thank you both. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both indeed. Perhaps we can call it here. If folks want to continue looking into your work, Hermione and Tamara, are there ways to either get in touch or do some research on your work?
Yes, there are. Tamara, where's your work online at the moment? If you got a...
I think just direct everyone towards the website, and then that can...
I keep a blog called The Anthropology of Other Animals. I'm just typing it in. And yeah, and you can find out more there. Posts relating to this talk, something from Tamara also, a trail to follow, will be up there shortly, and links to other things that we've done. But yeah, thank you so much, David and Sal, for hosting us, and to the beautiful Dispersed Holdings project and the broader Printed Matter Book Fair. It's really fun that we're kind of in New York, but we're not in New York. A bit dazzling. But yeah, it's such a lovely opportunity to have this conversation. It's been really developmental for us, and thanks to everyone also for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thanks everybody out there who might be watching on YouTube Live. I'm going to stop the stream in just a moment, but yeah, thank you again, Tamara and Hermione. just exceptional, so generative, really, really amazing talk. And thank you, Jeff, for joining us. That was wonderful. All right, I'm gonna